World! World! This is my actual guitar from like 2000, I believe. I restrung it just for that bit and learned how to play that part of that song just for that bit. Dedication. Before we get started, let's be 100% clear here. No one studio is to blame for this current situation. Sure, it's tempting to lay all the blame at Sony's feet because, after all, they've shown that they don't really know how to make a good Spider-Man movie on their own. But Disney's not off the hook here either. Sure, you could argue they deserve some financial compensation for all the work they do in these new Spider-Man films, but at the same time, do they really need any more money? Seriously, like, we're all gonna subscribe to Disney Plus when it comes out. They don't need another 50% or whatever of this particular box office. Anyway, yeah, Spider-Man is officially out of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Kevin Feige is no longer giving creative input for the future solo Spider-Man films. Tom Holland is allegedly still Spider-Man, but nobody from the Avengers films will cameo in future Spider-Man movies anymore, and Spider-Man will no longer cameo in future Avengers films anymore. So I hope you enjoyed seeing Happy Hogan hit on Aunt May, because it doesn't look like we're gonna get that again anytime soon. R.I.P. Megan. I'm not gonna lie, this news is legit sad. It's upsetting that Spider-Man is no longer going to be a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe anymore. We all wanted him to be there in the first place, and now they're just taking him out of it. Even Jeff Goldblum is sad about it.
Why do you think Spider-Man is such an important part of the MCU? Because there may be a little divorce happening.
No, this is the first I've heard of it.
Save Spider-Man?
I'm crestfallen.
So of course, now is the perfect time to speculate on what's going to happen with future Spider-Man movies. Again, but only this time, we're doing it without the safety net of the MCU. All signs are currently pointing to Tom Holland remaining as our live-action Spider-Man. I mean, the guy even said so himself, and that's great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Sony will continue the story of this live-action Spider-Man. As we all saw in Far From Home, Spider-Man was left with his status quo dramatically shaken. He's now in a position that no other Spider-Man movie has ever placed their main character in. It's a place that's very exciting. The storytelling potential here is literally out of this world. I'm just not convinced that Sony is going to continue this particular plot thread. They've shown in the past that they're seemingly willing to sabotage their greatest cash cow even when they have a great thing going. Spider-Man 2 is still to this day regarded by many as the greatest superhero film of all time. But instead of letting Sam Raimi just do his thing and keep that trend going, somebody at Sony got the bright idea to add Venom and Gwen Stacy and all this other crap to it, and the result is a movie that nobody likes. And even when Sam Raimi was willing to come back and do a fourth Spider-Man movie to try and end his series on a high note, Sony decided, no, we don't need you anymore. We'll do it with somebody else for much cheaper. And we're kind of seeing history create itself here. I mean, after all, Kevin Feige was the primary creative force for these last two live-action Spider-Man films. Any future live-action Spider-Man films, with Tom Holland at least, are going to be dramatically different from what came before. And that's with or without Jon Watts, the director of Homecoming and Far From Home. At the time of this recording, he is currently not signed on to do any future Spider-Man films. And neither are the screenwriters, Chris McKenna and Eric Summers. So unless Sony decides to rehire all of those guys for the next Spider-Man film, we're looking at the very real possibility that the everybody in the world knows Spider-Man is Peter Parker cliffhanger from the end of Far From Home does not get followed up on. Spoiler alert for Far From Home, I guess. You all saw it by now, right? I'm already anticipating this new Spider-Man 3 to have very little connection to the previous films, if any at all. I'm sure the cast will return. Tom Holland, Marissa Tomei, Zendaya, the kid who plays Ned, at least they will come back. But there's still that part of me that believes that they're not going to even bother to continue with this gold mine of a plot thread. If anything, there's the very real chance that they could just brush it off with a line of dialogue and say, oh, that happened in between films. That way they can just rush to the Sinister Six like they've been trying to do since Amazing Spider-Man 2. Or God forbid, a Venom crossover. I know I've said I wanted that in the past, but now I'm not so sure anymore. Picture it this way. Picture the transition from Batman Returns to Batman Forever. Technically, the continuity was the same, certain actors returned, but everything else dramatically different. That's what I'm picturing for the sequel to Spider-Man Far From Home. Perhaps I'm being a bit too negative. I mean, can you blame me? This is a negative thing that happened. But maybe there is a bright side to all this. Is there a possible silver lining to this bad news? Well, let's assume that Tom Holland, Marissa Tomei, and all the other principal actors do return for a hypothetical Spider-Man 3. Let's assume that Sony does rehire John Watts and McKenna and Summers to write the thing, and that they do follow up on the everybody knows Peter Parker Spider-Man thread from the end of Far From Home. That's all great, obviously. Well, in addition to all that, now the creators are forced to make a Spider-Man movie that's not going to rely on a particular crutch that they have been using since 2017, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Let me explain. Look, I love the last two Spider-Man films. I love that we now have a Spider-Man that's firmly entrenched in the MCU. It just feels right. But those two films do rely heavily on the MCU and Spider-Man's place in it. They rely heavily on scenarios and characters from previous films in order to establish who Spider-Man is. And that worked really well for those two movies, but I don't think we need it anymore. This Spider-Man is pretty well established by now. We all know who he is and what his deal is. The creators don't really need the help of the MCU anymore. They can finally focus on just making a good solo Spider-Man film. And what better solo Spider-Man story than one where he can't rely on Nick Fury, Happy Hogan, or any of the Avengers really? And dealing with the fallout of the events of Far From Home could be the ultimate I need to fix this mess alone scenario. And those scenarios make for the best Spider-Man stories. Plus, Spider-Man can't rely on the Avengers and in particular Iron Man all the time. There was gonna come a point where he'd have to deal with stuff on his own. And yeah, it might have come sooner than expected, but it was gonna get here eventually. It'll be nice to see a Spider-Man story that's actually focused on Spider-Man again. One that's less about what Iron Man might think of him, but one about him struggling to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. It undeniably 100% sucks that Spider-Man is no longer part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And now we have to live under the assumption that Sony and Disney are not going to work things out and he's going to remain separate from the MCU for the foreseeable future. But even if that's the case, I still think it's possible to get a good Spider-Man story made in this day and age, especially with all the groundwork that was laid beforehand. So we really shouldn't be doing anything like boycotting Sony movies or not buying the PlayStation 5, which is dumb and has nothing to do with anything. Otherwise, we could miss out on a potentially great Spider-Man film. I mean, again, the groundwork is there. Sony must have learned something from all those years working with Kevin Feige, right? Right? For what it's worth, I do have faith that Disney and Sony will work something out. How they'll do that, I have no idea. Maybe Tom Holland will trap them in a room and force them to come to an agreement. Or maybe Disney will just buy Sony Pictures outright. That's not me making a joke. That's literally something that could very well happen in 2019. That's the world we live in. But ultimately, no matter what happens, I'm not worried about the character of Spider-Man. He will find a way to bounce back from all this. He's very resilient, and I mean, after all. To him, life is a great big bang up. Whenever there's a hang up, you'll find a spider. Bam. What do you think will happen to Spider-Man now that he's out of the MCU? Do you think Sony can make a good movie out of this scenario, or do you think they'll screw it up like they have previous Spider-Man films? Do you think there's any hope for Spider-Man returning to the MCU? I sure think there is. Let me know down below or anywhere on the internet. I still think they can reference the MCU, just not directly. They'd have to do something like the Netflix shows did, where it wasn't the Chitauri invasion, it was the incident. Like we were stupid and didn't know what that was. And I know we've gotten Spider-Man films in the past that were separate from the MCU that have been good to great, but man, once you see Spider-Man standing next to Iron Man like he does in the comics, there really is no going back to the way it was before. Of course, don't forget that we have new videos every Tuesday and Wednesday, with Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern being Wulff Den Live. So subscribe to see all of that, like this video, and share it with a friend who isn't expecting to hear bad acoustic guitar covers of old punk songs in their YouTube videos about superhero films. I think that'd be a good prank to pull on somebody. Thank you all for watching. I will see you next time.